Okay, I'm Tom Rubin, and my job is to get us out of here so we can have lunch. And I've been in the transit industry for going on 30 years, but it actually seems like far, far longer. Let's talk a couple of statistics. Right now, according to Schumann Latterly in their 2003 survey, there are 21 U.S. cities and 3 each in Canada and Mexico, with a total of 571 miles of light rail. I have another survey of existing light rail in North America, and this came out to, let's see, there's a grand total of, let's do somewhere, there we go, it's 100 different light rail and trolley projects. Now, this was taken from a report that the US DOT does every year and sends to Congress. It's basically the funding request. This one was the 2003 annual report on new starts, and the new one came out, and frankly, I didn't have the heart to look at it. In final design, which is the last stage before it actually gets to final approval, gets to construction, there are a grand total of 14 projects with a total capital cost, and I say total, that's not just the federal, that's the total capital cost of $8.7 billion. In the next step back, preliminary engineering, there were 38 projects with a total capital cost of $39.7 billion. And then the also eligible list, the ones that hadn't gotten into preliminary engineering, these did not all have costs, so I can't count the cost, but it was dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens. It was a section of a 8.5 by 11 book, and about that much of it, about 3 to a page, was just a listing of the projects with an early description. That's what we're looking at. Coming soon to a city near you. Okay. Now, there are several stages in the process, and it's important to understand the different stages, and important to understand what you can do at various steps along the way. You have heard some very good advice from our previous speakers, and I'm going to try not to duplicate it, though I may amplify a few things. The initial phase is what we call the gleam in somebody's eye phase. The most dangerous phrase that every transit general manager dreads to hear is after a board meeting when one of the members says, well, see you next month, the spouse and I are taking the kids to Disneyland. Because they know they're going to be hearing about monorail for quite a while thereafter. And so we have the Disneyland effect. Of course, that does not apply only to monorails. It applies to light rail, heavy rail, and everything else you can think of. So it's important to get in early and stay there. Get in early, stay there. I can't emphasize that enough. The next step is preliminary planning. And this is an early stage before you actually get official dedicated federal funding. Now, most but not all of the projects, and almost all of the major projects, will have federal funding. But and so I'm going to talk mainly to that. Here you have some opportunities if you're in there early enough. If you don't, well, there's an old saying, there's 3 types of people. There are those that make things happen, there are those that watch things happen, and there are those that ask, what happened? You don't want to be in that last group. Okay. At that point, that's why you want to be there. Now, we talked about one thing earlier, which is you have to understand what is going on. Anybody out there who thinks that facts have any importance in these decisions? Anybody out there who thinks that transportation decisions have much to do with transportation? Okay. Well, we hope that you'll listen and learn. I believed that at one point, but after almost 30 years in the industry, I've come to see it a little bit clearer.
That's why I'm here.
Okay. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. Now, as the things progress, what you want to do is be on the inside. There's a couple of ways to do this. Many of you will be in an area where the transit agency boards are made up of appointed representatives that are appointed by cities or counties or by individual mayors or whatever. Find out what the makeup of your board is. Take a look at who the members are, how long they've been there, etc. Find a local politician that you like, trust, and support, and get active in that person's campaign. Raise money, hold fundraisers, etc. And let that person know that your objective is to represent him or her on your transit board. That is the best thing you can do to have some degree of control over this. Do that early, do that often, encourage other people of like thinking do the same thing. After we get through the initial process, the next phase in the official federal process is alternatives analysis. Now here you're doing a couple things. One, you are doing a corridor level analysis of mode and alignment alternatives. In other words, rubber tire, steel wheel, where's it going to go? The other thing you have to do is make sure this is coordinated with your multimodal metropolitan and state planning documents. And that should include, in most cases, a long-range transportation plan. Once you get through this, you get into, and there's action at the local level, which generally at a minimum includes the transit agency, the metropolitan planning organization, in many cases that's a council of governments or similar name, and at a minimum some of the key cities and in some cases counties along the way. So again, you have to understand your local politics to know what the approval process is. At that point, you will attempt to get into preliminary engineering. This is when you start getting some serious federal money in most cases. Your entry must be approved by the FTA regional office. The activities must be in what is known as the Transportation Improvement Plan, which is a 5-year capital plan, basically. And usually at this point, you are going to require an environmental impact study under the National Environmental Policy Act, almost always for major projects. There are a couple of exceptions. The major one is commuter rail. In many cases, there is exclusion. There are categorical exemptions if you are talking about running commuter rail on an existing railroad. But even there, check the rules carefully. There are many cases where you will find that it isn't excluded if you know what you're doing. For example, if they are running a single-track railroad through a wetland, and part of the plan is to go to double track, contact your local environmentalists for help.
Tom, excuse me, could you wait just while I change tapes?
Also known as a FONSI. And that must be done by FTA, and you have to have specific FTA approval. This also requires that you have your funding plan in place and your source of funding. You can get into preliminary engineering without a dedicated funding source, but to get into final design, you have to have that tax or other funding source in place. And that is where elections come in. Now, you are, in this stage, you're doing preparation of final construction plans and construction management plans. Finally, after all of that, you get into construction. As a practical matter, 1, FTA, Federal Transit Administration, has to approve it. 2, it has to be included in the administration's president's draft or proposal for the Surface Transportation Authorization Act. Now that is currently up for renewal. And if you aren't in that, then you're in big trouble. Now, if the administration recommends it, great. But what is really important is that Congress puts it in. And there are cases where it's not in the administration plan, Congress puts it in. That's what's final in this country. Now, again, you want to play both the FTA, which will be honchoing this, the White House in many cases, and Congress. Congress is the most important. Once you have gotten that approval and you get what is known as a full funding grant agreement, which is nothing more than a promise to ask for the money, you are subject to the annual appropriation process. Goes to Congress every year. You got to go up every year and fight for the money. Okay, now where can you attack this? Gleam of the eye level, you got to be in there. You got to talk to the people who have these wonderful ideas. They come from all places. It's not just the transit board or the transit staff. In San Jose, it was a candidate for mayor who made this Bart to San Jose his mantra. You got to get in and see who has these wonderful ideas and try to kill at them. And preliminary engineering, a lot of this is not really very apparent to the public. In many cases, there are things such as major investment plans, where they will go out to local governments, they will go out to certain key decision makers, but a lot of it will be very hard for the public to detect unless you're on top of it. You will likely miss it unless you are specifically looking at it. The next step is getting into corridor-specific planning. This is where they will be doing the environmental impact statements. Now, a couple of things to be aware of here. One, under the current rules, and they have changed in recent years, under the current rules, you must compare the preferred alternative to a baseline. There is specific language in the federal regulations that says the baseline will be, quote, the best you can do, unquote, without the major capital plan. If what they are proposing is to add one bus line over in this corner and add more service on this route here, is this the best that can be done? Are there other alternatives that are better? And that is when you have to come in and say, this does not meet the federal standard, and scream loud. Now, at this point, I advise you in most cases to not say light rail or whatever it is dumb. Say, fine, study it, but let's study the options. Let's make sure this is the best option. I agree, let's put rail on the table. Let's also put busways, let's put rapid bus, let's put bus rapid transit, let's put fare reductions, let's put a lot of other things on the table, have them evaluated completely and fairly, and see which really does the best. One other thing that you should be aware of, there's something in planning known as a modal preference. In other words, you know, there's a heck of a lot of people that'll get on a light rail line that will just never get on a bus. Well, you know, a lot of people believe it, a lot of rail proponents say that, and the FTA does not accept it. The FTA regulations do not allow a modal preference to be introduced into the transportation planning models unless, one, that mode already exists and is in operation in the specific urbanized area that is being considered, and two, there has been a study that has been accepted that shows that there is a modal preference. In other words, if you don't have a light rail line or whatever that is up and running, and somebody tries to slip in a modal preference, it should not be there. Now, one thing I will tell you is that the FTA tries to stay very neutral in these things. What this means is if you want to go to them and ask questions and ask for help, in most cases you can. I will tell you that they are very busy people because giving away billions of dollars every year is very hard work. It is a lot harder, for example, than being a loan officer. Loan officers have to be concerned that the money will be paid back at some time. But if you're giving money away, you aren't. And therefore, of course, you have far more applicants. And all joking aside, I know many, many very fine people at FTA who are incredibly overworked. So if you're going to go to them, start off with a level of knowledge, have specific questions, and if they tell you to research something, research, and then come back with your follow-up. Be respectful of them and their time, and I think you will find it'll be a useful resource. At this point, funding sources should not be considered. In other words, if you have a plan and you have a dedicated funding source that can only be used for a single purpose, such as rail, such as exists in many places, you should not consider it in the financial feasibility. It should not be there. Many times I have seen that violated. There are some other things that I would recommend very highly. One is consultant-specific actions. One, any consultant who works on the plan is absolutely prohibited from having any role in implementation, period. No exceptions, end of story, goodbye. Why do you want to pay somebody $10 million so they can market a $100 million program? You want your consultants to be somewhat neutral at least. Second, if you are studying options, and that is something I cannot emphasize enough, study the options, think about getting completely separate teams of consultants, each to do the best job they can on their option. And if one is pushing light rail, fine, get the best light rail people you can find, and then get perhaps the best bus network planning people, or bus rapid transit, or high-speed busway on freeway people, and let them do their plan, and let each critique each other. Several other things. One, establish the evaluation methodology and the measurement metrics prior to beginning the analysis process. Don't let them come up with the metrics after they've got their hands on the data. Two, consider risk. Consider risk. If you are talking about a project that is basically a technology that you now have, such as bus, or a minor tune-up of it, such as busways, that is lower risk than something that you've never done before in your city, such as light rail. If you have a project that can be done in small incremental stages, where you can stop after each and get feedback as to how you're doing before you go on to the next, that is less risk than if you must invest $500 million before you get the first thing you can even begin to measure the results. Measure risk. It's important. In your metrics, if it isn't a direct transit statistic, forget about it. It's not important. Anything good that's going to come out of a transit project, trust me, can be measured on some very simple metrics. The key one is, what is the cost, or better yet, the subsidy per new rider, and how many new riders can we get for the money available? That's the key one. No matter what it is, that's a side benefit. If you're talking about congestion relief, as if a transit project could do that, it's usually so small it gets lost in the rounding. But if you're going to talk about congestion relief, then the number of passengers you carry is a very good metric that will give you the congestion relief. Now, the official FTA standard is now been shifted. It used to be something called incremental cost per incremental passenger, or what is commonly shortened to cost per new passenger. Well, unfortunately, people like Wendell Cox, who's here at this conference, and others kept taking these costs per new passenger and saying, well, let's see, that's the cost for a one-way trip on one day. Well, if you double that, you multiply it times 260 work days a year, you know, that's $9,000 a year. You can lease a Jaguar for that. And so I went to the workshop where they explained the new metric, and a very honest guy from the FTA got up and said, one of the main reasons it was being changed was they got tired of people getting up and saying, for that kind of money, you can lease a new Jaguar. Congress blessed them every so often does something nice, and it required cost per new passenger to continue to be reported, so it's there. But the new metric is incremental cost per travel hour saved, which refers not only to transit, but freeway and highway and street. And believe me, there is nobody in the world who can make any sense out of that stuff. And that, of course, is one of the main reasons we're going to it. If you're talking about air quality, again, generally, if you are carrying more passengers, you're going to have a bigger impact on air quality. And one other very important thing, who are you carrying? The fact is, the most transit dependent, the people who are one step above, having no other option but the bus or whatever, the people who have finally scraped up enough money to buy that 1964 Chevy are driving the dirtiest junkers in the world. And those cars are often 1, 2, or 3 orders of magnitude. An order of magnitude is times 10. 10, 100, 1,000 times dirtier than current cars. You ain't going to clean up the air by getting yuppies out of their BMW. If you are taking people out of those 1964 Chevys that were last tuned in 1976, if you don't count taking the air cleaner off and sticking your thumb down the carburetor throat so you could get it started this morning, you are doing some good things for air quality. And more important, you are doing it in a high impact area of the city. That's what you want to look at for air quality. And of course, improvements in urban form. No, I'm not going to go there. Okay. Then we get into elections. Elections involving transit can be a number of things. What is the normal process is what's known as the Christmas tree approach. You put something under the tree for everybody. So you split the money so, you know, the local cities get something. And there's something for bus, and something for rail, and something for highways, and something for freeways. Well, if you're going to have any impact there, you got to be at the table when that split's being done. You don't necessarily have to be an elected official, but you do have to be at the table representing an organized group of some influence. Now, what can I tell you? Seek out allies. I'll give you one in particular. Seek out your biker coalitions. Bikes are the most underutilized method of transportation in the U.S. And they can be very important. And frankly, it doesn't cost very much. If you meet with your bikers and hear them out, you will often find out that you are very happy to help them with what they want to do. And they, in turn, can help you do what you want to do. And you will often find that your needs are pretty close. But seek out your allies where you can find them. You should, at all costs, try to restrict putting in funding restrictions in a ballot issue that direct money for specific purposes and specific purposes only, such as rail. It is premature. What can you do to say, right now we've got this money that can only be used for rail, when you still have to do the decision process, the analysis process, the EIS, etc., to decide what the best mode is? What would happen if we do the recommendation, it comes back and says, you know, rail just doesn't work very well, but this other idea does? Why would you want to restrict yourself? Very logical. That, of course, has virtually nothing to do with the process. You want to put together your own group. You want to be able to work with a lot of people. Be prepared for clashes. Be prepared for some people who will get up and leave. But keep the core group together. Raise money wherever you can. If you're getting into an election, be prepared to be outspent by the pro people by an average of about 12 to 1. Be prepared. Doesn't sound good, The good news, you have better than a 50% chance, well better than a 50% chance of winning if you can get even 8 or 10% of what the opposition is funding. And I'm only talking about the official opposition. I'm not talking about the agency, what they are spending with their tax money, which doesn't count because that's for public information. Hire a good political pro early. And for God's sakes, listen to them. In particular, they will give you advice on how to win an election. That's the business you're dealing in, not how to design the best transportation plan. Facts often have very little to do with elections, only where they fit in. You will find, for example, that most of your good political pros, and I mean a local political pro, somebody who knows how things work. I mean things like having the address of every ethnic newspaper in the region, because that is a great way to get very cheap exposure if you just know how to use it and get a lot of votes. And if you can get the emphasis there, you can often do a lot of good in a lot of communities. But get your political pro and listen to them. They will often tell you, we can't put out 17 different messages. People won't listen. They can't take it. I remember one election I had some role in that was overall one of the best opposition ones I ever saw, which was in Austin a few years ago. And there was a great clash of wills over what to do. And finally, after at some point even yelling and screaming, they agreed to go with the political pro, who came up with a very simple theme. Costs too much, does too little. How the hell can you forget that? It says it all. That was the theme. They plastered that everywhere. They said it everywhere. People saw that. They remembered it. Remember, in an election, you're going to be one ballot issue out of what might be an election that, if it was printed, would be the size of a bed sheet. It's very difficult to even get people to realize that they're voting on this before they get to the ballot box. Finally, remember that transportation decisions have very little to do with transportation. Facts are nice, but they often have virtually no impact, particularly on politicians that have made a commitment. You have to get to your politicians early. In politics, to borrow an old saying from drag racing, there is no substitute for cubic dollars. But when you spend your time and your money is often important. Get in there early and stay in there. Spend your money wisely when you have money to spend. Seek out people who have gone through this in other places. And I will include myself and many other people who are at this conference. We have been through it before. We have heard the arguments. There will be times when you need somebody who can listen to an argument and instantly tell you why you are listening to a lie. You've heard several examples of that today. Stick around. I'll be speaking a couple more times. There are more transit professionals who've been around. You will hear a heck of a lot more lies. And yet, you can't kill them. You cannot come up with a slip-through proof wooden stake. So what I'm telling you is, remember, in the words of Dandy Don on Monday Night Football many years ago, you got to get that fickle superstar on your team. That fickle superstar, momentum. So get your team together and work it, and get in there early, and don't ever, ever leave. Thank you very much. Be happy to take questions for any of us at this time, and we timed it almost exactly, but what the heck. Yes?
On your point of the full funding grant agreement, we lost that battle last year on the Seattle project, and in the sense of preventing it. We were told, Tom, that there has never been a full funding grant agreement executed by FDA for which the subsequent congressional appropriations had not been made. And I wonder if you know any different. Do you know of anyone that?
Yeah, yes, I do. There is one that I know of, and that is the Los Angeles Red Line East Side line. There was a full funding grant agreement on that. There was the agency, Los Angeles MTA, got into financial difficulty, and the whole thing collapsed. SCAG, the regional body, Southern California Association of Governments, ordered it taken out of the long-range plan, which automatically kills it. And there was a local election that was sponsored by one of the transit agency board members that prohibited the use of local sales tax on subways. Now, frankly, that thing, the election had so many holes in it that you can drive a train through it sideways, which the same guy who put it on the ballot then used to get a subway funding. But it showed a commitment, and for once the agency actually listened. By the way, it passed by just about 2-1. And the most interesting thing about it is the two districts in the city, the two council districts in the city of LA, we have 15 in LA, that were next to get a rail line, a subway, were right on the countywide average, against 2-1. So of course they immediately went out to plan more subways. Yes?
We have a situation where we're at, where the federal funding is all in place, they've already gotten some of it. They're about ready to go out to construction bid, and we're pretty confident that that's going to come in way over.
And you're from?
Northern San Diego County.
Okay, thank you.
My question for you is, the only place they're going to have to go is back to the Fed for that additional money. Will the Fed actually give them more money than they've already committed to when they've gone over and gotten this far?
I'm going to have to give you a somewhat detailed answer. There are several sources of federal funding. The main one that most people are looking at is what is known as New Starts. Technically, it is 49 USC 5309, and actually some part of 5309. But that is the federal New Start pot that is used only for new guideway transit. It is extremely difficult to get more money out of that pot. There is wording in the actual full funding grant agreement that says don't bother even trying, with a few very minor exceptions, which to my knowledge have never been honored. I know of only one case, and that was in Atlanta about 10 years ago, where somebody was actually successful in getting more funding from that pot. That said, there are a lot of funding pots from the federal government. You have what's known as 49 USC 5307. These are formula funds that come to each agency, transit agency, on a formula basis that the agency can use for just about any purpose it wants. They are really intended, more than anything else, to replace buses and bus operating facilities as they go out of service, they reach the end of their useful life. I'm talking about a current bus agency. Obviously, it's a current rail agency. It's for replacement of rail as well. Well, the agency can decide to use that for about whatever it wants, and there have been cases where the agencies have decided to use it to fund their major capital investment project that came in over budget. Another one is CMAQ, Congestion Management Air Quality. Again, this is a formula funding. S2c Surface Transportation Program, another formula funding that comes in and is controlled by the MTO and is usually brought down to lower levels. They can go after all of those funds and more. And they say, oh, it's federally funded. Well, yeah, but this is money we had anyway. It's not new federal funding. And if we build that rail line and we use the money for that, then we don't replace the buses when they come to the end of the useful life. So that's what you're saying. And it's very hard to make that point because the number of people who even understand these intricacies is small. And the number of people who understand it, even when you explain to it, is smaller still. And remember, for most politicians who are making decisions, and forgive me again, long-term planning means what do we do after lunch? Real long-term planning means after the next election. That's the cycle you're working with. And so if you're saying this is going to really hurt us in 4 or 5 years, good luck. They ain't listening. And by then, no one will remember that vote. Yeah, I'm sorry. You, sir, in front.
How do you kill a rail project that isn't even designed to deal with commuters? We have a rail project in Santa Cruz County that is designed to get funding from the state in order to build a rail trail. A rail trail.
Okay, I'm familiar with that project, and it will be, in some ways, it will be very easy to operate because it will not be overburdened with those, what do you call it, passengers. And, you know, seek about afterwards. This is hilarious if you find out the details. All I can tell you
Tell us
is...
a bit about it, Tom.
Okay.
Describe the project. Would you describe it?
Well...
So we know what we're talking about. You want me to?
Yeah, why don't you? You're more familiar with the details than I am. It's hilarious.
So we have a project in Santa Cruz County. There's a 32-mile Union Pacific line that runs through the county, and they've been trying for years to get something going on there. They found this funding project. Proposition 116 was passed in 1990 in California to fund rail projects, improvement or new rail projects. They are using the Proposition 116 funding mechanism in order to buy the right-of-way through Santa Cruz County. The only way that they can qualify for Proposition 116 funding is if they have an operating passenger rail system. So they've come up with this tourist trolley thing that's a 6-mile stretch. It'll cost $9 each way. It'll only run 3 times a day and only 120 days out of the year. It's absurd in the sense of anybody actually riding it, especially since there's adequate parking at both ends. And they're not even major tourist destinations in the county. So they're using this to put in the thing, and the whole purpose is to get access to $11 million in state funds. They don't mention to the public that they're going to have to match those funds, and they don't mention to the public that the rail trail that they're selling to the public that would go on this right-of-way is going to cost an additional $30 million. So all the way around, it's a waste of money.
But it is a train, though.
It's a train that nobody's going to ride, and they've said it. In fact, they found two tourist rail providers in the area who have said that they would be interested in the project. And one of them came to a meeting and said that unless you give me the ability to walk right through EIRs, don't do any of the environmental impacts, just change any of the rates, change any of the schedules, change any of the implementation of it without any accountability. Unless you allow me to do that, it's doomed to fail.
Just a question about the trail component of this. And by rail trail, in the trail aspect, do they mean a mixed-use cyclist, pedestrian, skateboard, etc., recreational trail paralleling the railroad?
Right.
Do they intend to keep the line open to Davenport for the cement traffic?
Yep.
That's
not necessarily a conflict, but...
We will be happy to go over individual projects later. One thing I got to tell you is the bad news is they really don't know this, but they don't really need the operating rail line to buy the right-of-way. Cliff had a comment.
One thing I forgot to mention earlier on, one of the most interesting things that happened recently is that in the process of the federal suit that we've been processing, we were granted discovery by the federal magistrates, and so the feds and the city had to hand over the documents. And I think one of the most interesting things, and it's something that if you're fighting a wasteful rail project, which is what we're here for, is that you should understand that none of the documents, whether it be the FEI, any of the environmental impact statement, all of the ROD, the record of decision, which is the final acceptance, none of that was prepared by our city people or the FTA. Okay? Every single document we found was originally drafted by Parsons Brinckerhoff. Okay? Every single document. And you know, we found that. And the other thing that we found was that Parsons Brinckerhoff is very, very smart, astute people, and they're very clever. They cover every aspect of it and things that you will never see. We found a report on privatization that any one of us might have written on transportation, okay? And it was buried in a report that had been submitted, quote unquote, by Parsons Brinckerhoff to the city, which the city then conveniently left out of the environmental impact statement. But it was one of those things Parsons could oversight. We wrote it.
Who's Parsons?
Parsons Brinckerhoff. The Parsons and Parsons Brinckerhoff is the guy who built the original New York City subway. It is the largest firm in this area, and they will do soup to nuts. Everything from the first original concept all the way to managing the construction, and of course, providing great assistance in going to Congress and getting political contribution. What we're going to do is I'm going to let each panelist make some final comments, and I guess we're going to have lunch here, but let's keep going as long as people are interested and we aren't screwing up lunch.
Thank you so very much. I just wanted to simply say thank you. I think that this was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. It certainly has been for me. It's an opportunity for us to mix and to network together and come up with greater ideas on how to serve our local areas as we go back home. I've been blessed to be here. Certainly enjoyed meeting everyone and sharing with great intellectuals as we look at our means and modes of transportation and the effects that it has on our economics. I will certainly be taking great information back home. Please, I've left some cards and a couple of brochures here for you, anyone that's interested, and please rest assured that if you need anybody to come help you beat the streets, knock on doors, motivate people to understand the pros and cons of the situation and win an election, call me. I'll be happy to come up and share. Thank you so much.
I have a couple of comments. One is Parsons Brinckerhoff. Somebody described them as they will provide the highest rail ridership projections that money can buy. Again, they are probably the foremost tailors of the Emperor's new suit. Thank you.
I think if you go on my website, you have to read the original story about the Emperor's new clothes, because you know the thing, and it's so appropriate for rail, because the original thing was that the tailors told everybody was, if you can't see the cloth, it's only stupid people that can't see the cloth. Only stupid people and people unfit for office.
Well, again, I think lunch is starting, but if you want to keep asking questions or ask questions while you're getting lunch, go right ahead. Yes, sir, over here.
Yeah, I'm Eric Clapham from Houston, and of course you're familiar with the recent outcome. I have my theories on it, but I was just wondering, from your perspective, what went wrong in Houston? How did that happen? Why did he
Well, one of the key things in Houston, in my mind, there were two keys. One very key thing, for many years, the main paper, the Houston Chronicle, has been extremely active in promoting light rail. There is a famous internal memo that leaked, and you know the one I mean, I'm sure, where a couple of years ago, where somebody on the internal staff set forth a program for the paper to implement to do a set of stories and editorials supporting light rail. And they've never apologized for it. They admit that it's true, but somehow it got in the hands, it was on the website for about 2 hours, and somebody saw it, immediately realized what it was, and downloaded it before it vanished forever. And it's been a scandal ever since. But it is the main newspaper. The other thing is the other thing I was very disappointed in is a former mayor of Houston, Bob Lanier, who was in the late 80s. He's a big man in Houston, to say the least. He was very active in the Texas Transportation Commission. Do I have that correctly? On the highway side as well as on other modes of transit. He was brought in by the then mayor, Tootsie, who she's known as that because she looked almost exactly like Dustin Hoffman in the movie, role of the same name, though she was a fair bit shorter. She used to work for my firm, which is another long story. But anyway, he was very key in, he was appointed to the Metro Board by the mayor to implement the rail plan as it existed at that time. Right. And he decided this was just not a very good program and started opposing it. So they had a falling out. He ran for mayor and won, which gave him control of the Metro Board. And he completely turned it around, basically canceled the rail program at that time and substituted or put the emphasis on a program of freeway improvement, HOV lane busways on many of the major freeways, and a turn back of a major share of the sales tax to local communities for local street improvement. And as a result of that, over a period of over a decade, Houston was about the only major metropolitan area in the U.S. that did not show a decline in congestion. It was holding even for well over a decade in congestion because they were making investment into rail. I'm sorry, into everything but rail, but putting it into freeways and to buses, etc., into surface transportation, rubber tire. And unfortunately, he did, at the end, endorse the watered-down version of the initial plan that was submitted to the voters, which everybody in Houston who with above room temperature IQ sees as the foot in the door, and will just go on merrily for many years from that point. So those were the two key things in my opinion. One other thing, they had the election in November. The first rail line started pre-revenue service to testing a few days after the election, actually started service in January, and I think it has been widely viewed as a disaster. My last count was they had 33 train versus auto collisions. It is the most incredibly bad safety design I have ever seen. And I went down to Houston to take a look at it. It is unbelievable the crap they did there. And so to correct that, their latest move has been that at every intersection where a train goes through, there will be a red light for a minimum of 15 seconds before the train goes through to allow the intersection to clear. This is a 7.5-mile line north-south from the north side of downtown Houston down to the Texas Medical Center, which is a major trip generator, and then to the Astro Complex, which most people would know as the Astrodome, which is no longer a football stadium because they just built a new one. Can you imagine what that north-south line, 7.5 miles long, and that kind of screwing around the traffic signals is going to do? It's going to be fun to watch. Yes.
We've got a situation in Sacramento where we just picked a locally preferred alternative, and
South side?
No, it's
to the
downtown
airport?
to the airport.
Yeah.
We have one of the issues is safety, because what they want to do is put it up a section of road that is already developed. It's like a 75-foot wide section. They're going to want to put the rail lines in the traffic lanes, mixing it in with vehicles. An alternative that they looked at but never considered seriously was to run along the I-5 freeway, which would have allowed them to be totally grade separated. The most preferable design for safety versus the least preferable. Is safety something that we can fight it on? the fact that this is the, you know, I know there's studies that show that this is the most dangerous type of alignment.
Well, there's no doubt about it. The safety considerations in Sacramento, what you're describing is what they did at Houston. Running light rail down the middle of a two-way street, particularly in arterial, particularly a lot of cross traffic, particularly left turns, is exceedingly dangerous. And if you raise the speed of vehicles past 35, you've got a disaster of the first magnitude. Now, can you fight it on safety? The answer is yes, and the follow-up to that is you will lose. The reason is that if they put it in that way, and if they follow the relevant rules that are put out by the California Public Utilities Commission and by state law, local ordinance, what you will find is virtually without exception, every single time there is a train versus car or train versus pedestrian incident, it will be the fault of the driver or the pedestrian and they will be cited. Therefore, it is not chargeable as a light rail accident under the federal rules. That's the problem. And you can fight it and you can try, you can show how difficult it is, but it's a problem. Now, this is a very common thing. One of the critical things in light rail is speed. You don't want to run in city streets because that's slow. But if you're running along the I-5 corridor, who are you serving? And access to the line is also very important. So it sounds like they have made up their mind and they are not going to let facts get in the way. I've been following that from Oakland for some time, and good friggin' luck. Also, as usual, they have not done a whole lot of alternatives analysis other than where do we put the railroad. I think we're into lunch. I thank all of you. There will be several other rail sessions that will be coming, including after we have our main lunch speaker. So I thank you very much, and please join me in thanking the speakers at this session.